Mr. Munkelt from California Association of Criminal Justice, for Criminal Justice.
Thank you, Chairman Quirk. Stephen Munkelt, an attorney and a licensed to practice in California and a certified specialist in criminal law. I am a member of the California Attorneys for Criminal Justice Legislative Committee, and I think that's how I got invited here today, but I'm not speaking for CACJ. It's pretty easy to recognize that given our values as a nation, that forced labor is immoral and illegal. Whether that's labor is obtained through actual force and violence, through threats and fear, or economic oppression, our state and national laws prohibit that conduct and that abuse of the individual liberties of the workers, whether it's in sweatshops or agricultural fields or in sexual services. And there's an even stronger moral and emotional objection to minors being abused and deprived of their liberty in that way. But sitting in the world of criminal law, the definition of human trafficking that has developed in California over the last 10 years seems to me, and I think many of my colleagues, to be more of the political phrase of the moment, the fad of the moment, than it is a guide to good policy. And one aspect of that is, as the chairman has pointed out, the difficulty in finding good statistics on what is human trafficking, what is the problem, what really are we trying to address. The term modern slavery has been used almost interchangeably with human trafficking, and that gives a lot of the political force to this topic because it brings to mind immediately in the minds of Americans workers chained, slaves driven to the fields, large semi-trailers with people shipped from town to town to perform services at gunpoint or under great force or coercion. Those kinds of scenarios spring to mind, and in fact, they're displayed on popular television shows on a pretty routine basis. But under California law today, as it's developed since 2005 and 2012 and in Proposition 35, we have, to borrow a word, conflated the concept of human trafficking, especially in sex work, with garden variety prostitution, pimping, and pandering. We refer to all of the young people, whether minors or adults, involved in sex work as having been trafficked, whether or not they've ever been imprisoned, whether or not they've ever been threatened. When I checked with some of my colleagues in Southern California, and they said, yeah, we're having a big problem with trafficked young women, that there's a fairly large number of them that are being addressed in the system. And one of the problems is that law enforcement has a great deal of difficulty separating out this sex worker who's a criminal and identifying them instead as a victim and relieving them of criminal responsibility in order to make them a witness against somebody else or whatever the scenario is. There's a great deal of struggle. I think District Attorney O'Malley mentioned part of that in her efforts to deal with this change of roles that's enforced by viewing ordinary sex work as trafficking and identifying people as having been trafficked when, in fact, their experience may not be that at all. Or it may be a relatively routine, historically normal version of pimping and pandering, where persuasion and forms of coercion are used to get people into the industry. But we have always had in California, since the penal code was first drafted in 1872, we've always had that behavior criminalized and appropriate penalties for it. And Chairman, you've noted that we have more people imprisoned for those crimes than we do for this new title du jour of human trafficking. It may be that that's because there really isn't that much real trafficking, that real human slavery element going on? We don't know. The Attorney General's report in 2012 talks about 3 categories: labor trafficking, domestic servitude, and sex trafficking. I think really in terms of policy making, you legislators should be thinking about that as 2 forms or two components of trafficking, because I think the solutions are different in these 2 areas. If you're talking about labor trafficking or domestic servitude, you're talking about workers who are performing otherwise lawful services. They're doing a job down at the market, or they're sewing clothes in a sweatshop, or they're out in the field doing whatever they're doing. But the labor itself is lawful. Sex trafficking, as Mr. Mosley has noted, we have the problem that all the workers are criminalized. That what they're doing is seen as criminal from the outset. You have completely different sets of tools that you can use in those 2 situations. With people performing lawful labor, you have wage and hour laws, you have OSHA, you have a whole variety of tools administratively and legally to try to make sure that people who are working in lawful employment are getting paid appropriately, supervised appropriately, and that they have remedies if they're abused. When you've got a criminalized labor industry like sex work, those people can't reach out to government and expect not to have consequences, adverse consequences. They can't check identification to make sure that everybody's of a legal age. They have no real motivation to do that either, because everything's illegal, so who cares if it's underage or overage? So I think you have different problems and different tools in those 2 areas. The CACG Legislative Committee, when we see the bills that come through this committee and the legislature, and an example would be the ones this year that have that human trafficking tag on them, most often it's trying to expand even further from the notion of real human slavery and extreme situations down to the street level of just run-of-the-mill, everyday sex work, prostitution, pimping, and pandering. So developing data is going to be difficult. As has been noted, there's a motivation for law enforcement to identify cases as possibly involving trafficking, because that helps drive statistics and that helps drive money.
If you could just sum up.
Sure. So at bottom, what I would say on behalf of the defense bar and the legal profession is that before you increase criminalization, before you stiffen penalties, you better work very hard at getting some legitimate data on what the problem really is, so that you can really intelligently define something that will help solve the problem rather than make it worse.